Hey everyone, my name's Dom, welcome back to the channel, and it's time for a review today of The Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilbourne. This book comes out today, the 8th of October 2021, so stick around to hear a bit more. So that's right, today is the book birthday of The Seventh Cadence by Jim Wilbourne. This is a debut novel and it's one of the first releases from this new indie publisher, Emergent Realms. I received an advance review copy of this book because the publisher thought that it would be the kind of book that I would be interested in, and spoiler alert, they were right. I really liked this book. So the early signs are that this is going to be a good series, and I'm hoping that that does continue whenever we get book 2, book 3 and so on, and continue with the Continua Chronicles. So the first thing about this book is that people have been getting interested in it based on the cover. It's got a really striking cover with those beautiful blues and that gorgeous dragon taking up prime position on the front of it. So it's got a lot of interest because of that, but I'm pleased to say that the book itself does actually live up to the quality of the cover as well. So that's definitely a great starting point. As always, this is going to be a non-spoiler review. I will give little bits of plot points and so forth, but I'll stick away from anything that's going to potentially disrupt your enjoyment of the book itself if you are going to read it. There are 3 main kind of story arcs to this book, but one of them does kind of kick off a little bit further along than the other 2, so I will steer clear of that one in terms of telling you what that particular arc is about. As we know from the synopsis of this book, we've got a world that's been kind of split up by war previously, and we have 5 nations in this world who are in kind of an unsteady alliance, and then a 6th nation, the Desert Dominion, are essentially exiled away from this alliance of the other nations. War is always in the background. There's always the threat that the Desert Dominion are going to try to attack and take over and to essentially reclaim their homeland. So alongside the backdrop of war, we have essentially the backdrop of magic as well and the lore of the world itself. So we have prophets who are, well, as prophet kind of suggests, they can see to a degree into the future. They are the great advisors of the rulers of these particular nations, and they give advice on things that are going to happen. Obviously with no real detail, but they can gain an idea on when something of real importance is going to happen and things like that. And then you've got the seers, who kind of almost seem to be underlings to the prophets. They're all housed together in this great magical city of Keldor, and the seers, they also have some kind of divination of the future. They can see things before they're going to happen to a certain degree. And this makes them a real threat in battle because they can see what's going to happen just before it does happen, and that makes them a fantastic fighting force. As a result, they are feared, they are not understood by the general populace, and they're essentially kind of sequestered away in Keldor. You don't really tend to see them out in the wider world very often. Now, in terms of the history and the lore of the world, the secrets of that are kept by the Keepers of the Covenant, and these are a group of people who are, they're essentially like scientists. They study and they work to understand how the world works and how magic works and so forth. And the Desert Dominion doesn't like these Keepers of the Covenant, and they have thief takers out in the world hunting down the last remaining keepers, capturing and killing them, so that the secrets they were looking after can be obtained by the Desert Dominion to increase their power. So the story starts off with one of these Keepers of the Covenant. She's on the run from thief takers, she's in the desert, she's on her own, she's not got a lot of supplies with her or anything like that. She's very much fighting to survive, not only from the thief takers but from the elements as well. We then have a seer who has been sent by the prophets essentially to find this keeper, to protect her, to save her from the thief takers, and to bring her back to Keldor, because that will be of great importance to the future and to the survival of these people, these allied nations. So those are our main kind of opening themes to the novel. The other main elements that we have are the battle itself, or the upcoming war, where we've got one of the nations in particular is kind of the first target of the Desert Dominion, and we see actual forces within the army who are going out there and they're going to be standing firm against the oncoming Desert Dominion. And we see some of the battle, we see some of the leadership, we see some of the struggles within that as people are trying to find their place within the battle, within the war of the army, and therefore essentially within the world. In terms of the characters, the main ones that we have, we kind of split into these three arcs. One of them is joint, so at the start we've got the Keeper of the Covenant, who is a young girl called Telly, and we've got the Seer, who is a young man called Navid. These two, I would say, are our main characters throughout the course of the book, and certainly in the early stages of the book, we definitely see a lot more of them than we see of the other characters. The next of our key characters, and one of the heads of the other story arcs, is Gabriel, who is the son of a king. We actually open up with a chapter detailing a battle involving this particular king, but the focus of the story in terms of his nation is actually his son Gabriel, and we're looking at him as a young warrior and someone who is trying to gain the respect of his people so that he can become the type of leader, the type of ruler who the people respect and they look up to and admire, rather than someone who's just leading because he was born into it. And then finally we have Amy, who is essentially an innkeeper's daughter, who ends up entangled in some of these wider plots with regards to the Keepers of the Covenant and the Desert Dominion, and gets dragged into this storyline largely against her will. Now, sticking to those four, I actually really quite liked the characters. In the whole, in the book itself, there were various other characters, obviously, who are going to play a part, and we're going to see bits and pieces from them. And for the most part, I thought they were all quite likeable. Even the ones who you're not supposed to like, you can appreciate the way that they've been written, and they're actually good characters, even if they're kind of the bad guys or the borderline bad guys, perhaps, within the story. The character I probably didn't like as much was Gabriel, because I just thought that his storyline was a bit of a worn path. It's one that we've seen in several other stories before, and that's not a bad thing, because obviously it was all done in its own way, and we see different things in this story than we'll have seen in other stories and so forth. So every character is their own character, they are unique characters. It's just that he's on a kind of path that we have seen before, but he still leads an interesting storyline and is still an interesting character, even if he's not my favourite of ones that we see in this book. Navid as well, he's a character who I didn't really find spectacular or anything along those lines. I was comfortable with him, he was a decent character, but he did definitely start to build as we got towards the end of the book, and we start to see some of his talents come into the fore, for instance. So he's already a key character in the story, and you can see that he's going to be a key character in kind of a wider world, but he definitely did evolve quite a bit within the story as well into the sort of character you can see is going to have some really interesting elements to him. The character of Telly, I thought, was one of the most interesting aspects of the book. Again, there's elements here that we've seen previously in other stories. She's a young, bright girl who hasn't really seen a lot of the world, and she's suddenly thrust out into the wider world, and she's sort of exploring what's ahead of her while she's also keeping an eye on what's behind her, because she knows that she's being chased all the time and people are trying to track her down, capture her, kill her, take away her secrets and so forth. And that gives an interesting element. She's definitely someone who's kind of street smart. She knows how to look after herself, and she demonstrates that at several points through the story. So she is a bit of a kind of kick-ass female character, which a lot of us do like to see in our stories as we're reading them. So she ticks that box definitely. She does have a few flaws in the way that she was written for me, in that she is a little bit too quick to judge, and sometimes there were instances where I felt that her interactions towards another character would be heavily influenced by something that didn't really seem that big of a deal when I read it. I thought that she was very quick to kind of change her perceptions of people and things like that. But at the same time, she's kind of had a sheltered existence up until the storyline of this book, so you can see that she's not really got a lot of experience of other people outside of her family, and there's maybe kind of a learning curve in regards to that, because she doesn't really know how to interact with people to a wider degree. She doesn't know how to react to things that they do and so forth. So that's quite interesting as well, to almost to start learning along with her how friendships work and how how they grow and things like that. So she was definitely an interesting character and one of my favourite aspects of the book. Amy, I thought, was another interesting one because, again, she's a young and bright character, and you can see as her story develops that she's going to have an important part to play in this overall storyline, although that's definitely not apparent from the point that we meet up with her. So I quite like that she's kind of introduced as essentially a side character, just someone who we're going to see and then we're going to move away from where she is, and that's it. So I was quite surprised, really, I suppose, when she started to come back into the story and play a bigger part in it. But I liked that, and she was actually one of my favourite characters because she's not necessarily your stereotypical character. Like Telly, for instance, I said she's kind of a kick-ass warrior woman almost, and you definitely don't have that with Amy. She's more almost demure. She's lived in this town, in this inn with her family all her life, and she's not had the experience of the wider world. She's not necessarily a pacifist, but she's definitely not a fighter, and she's been thrust into these events where she might have to change her perceptions on things like that. And it's going to be interesting to see how she develops. We already see part of it as we move through her storyline, but she's definitely got other talents, and she's more likely to go down those paths than down the paths of direct violence, for instance. So that's good to see because we don't always have just this one path ahead of us and this one method of resolving these conflicts. We can see with Amy that maybe there's going to be second options and she's going to be more prone to choosing those second options. So I'm quite interested to see how her storyline develops as well as those of the other characters here. In terms of the world, looking at the world map, it does seem like the world is maybe not very big in scope, but actually when we kind of zoom into the world map, you can see all these different areas of it, and we see within the book different parts of the world, different climates and so forth. So we do experience what you might call kind of a typical European medieval type of setting, and we see these towns that are in kind of almost a Goldilocks region where things are not too hot, not too cold, and then we see the extremes beyond that. So we see bits of jungle, we see bits of desert, and although they're not necessarily normally there, we do see bits of icy cold as well. So we do get to see various bits of the world, and we also get to see kind of close-ups because there's a map of the world at the start of the book, as you would expect with a lot of fantasy stories, but also throughout the book as we change between various chapters and various sections of the book, there are also close-up maps as well of some of the towns and the cities that we're seeing. So we do get to see a bit more. You can see that there's definitely been quite a bit of work put into the actual world building side of things. The other part of the world building, of course, is the history, the lore, the magic and that side of things. And I thought this was done quite well. We see magic almost as a forgotten art. These keepers of the covenant are they're not magicians, they're not wielders of magic, but some of the secrets that they hold are definitely to do with magic. The prophets and the seers definitely have magic in their blood, and they also do have some of the magical kind of history and the lore within this city of Keldor, for instance. They all have kind of their origins, I suppose, with this great wizard of history who essentially retired from the world. He took himself out of the world because of the great power that he had, and it was maybe a bit much for one person to wield. So he took himself out of the equation, and his city that he essentially created, Keldor, is where the seers and the prophets live. The prophets, at least, are kind of a lesser version of this great wizard, I suppose, in many ways. You've then got one of the prophets is the leader of the Desert Dominion, and the aim of the Desert Dominion really is to find these secrets to see if they will give them the means of bringing back this great wizard. And that's kind of their prophecy, I guess, that this great wizard will return and he will guide them back to greatness within the world and to dominance within this world. So there's definitely a lot of magical background in this, but it's kind of on the wane. People are not really trusting of magic, and it's not really something that's used very often. But one of the things that they do have in Keldor is this history. They've got the library and so forth, and they've got access to some of the magical tomes from this great wizard and from history. And you've got little things like, what do they call them, abbreviations, which, if I get this right, they are tied to these kind of magic books of history, I guess. So it's not the magic book itself, but it's almost like it's a segment that's been copied from this magic book, and it has a magical kind of intrinsic link to the original tome. So you can use these abbreviations to perform some magic, and it's done by essentially by chanting, by reading out the words of the actual spell itself. That's quite interesting. For me, it's not something that is necessarily your standard magic. We see various stories where you've got, you know, magic is on the decline and we're looking at bringing magic back as part of the story. So we've got those kind of elements to it. You've got the very few people who know how magic works, and you're looking at finding ancient artifacts or ancient spell books and so forth so that you can use the magic from it. And you've got other elements where you have people trying to create new spells, trying to use what they've learned from their studies to see how the magic works, and can they take that and extrapolate and build on it and create new spells. So there's a lot of interesting work regarding the actual magic side of things here as well. So what other elements do we have here? We've got a lot of the typical fantasy elements. So we have travel and exploring and the quest that our characters are on. We've got battle, we've got war, we've got magical creatures and terrible destruction and so forth. And as per the cover of the book, we do have dragons here as well. So there's loads to get your teeth into. The book itself is around about 700 pages. I think the ebook that I read was 730. So there's plenty of space here for all of those elements. The one thing for me that kind of let it down a little bit was that at times I felt that we were going too far, not necessarily into too much detail, but we were certainly following a little bit too closely with some of our characters. So the main example here for me is Telly. Whilst we're exploring with her as she's seeing these new parts of the world and experiencing all of these new cultures, people and so forth that she's never seen before, we do kind of follow her around a little bit. And I feel that in other stories we would maybe skip out a lot of what we saw with her as she's walking around and exploring a town and taking in the sights and the smells and so forth. So we're learning with her, we're exploring with her, but it wasn't for me the kind of the best way of doing that. It was a slowdown of the pace. It just extended that kind of part of the storyline where I felt that it could have been more abbreviated and we could have moved on easily enough to the next point. So especially for a debut novel, I think that's actually quite good, because there weren't many areas like that. There weren't many kind of negatives for me. The story overall was very enjoyable. The characters were very enjoyable and very likable. And I definitely left this book with a positive overall feeling. Will definitely recommend it, and will definitely look out for the second book in the series when it's available as well. So definitely good signs there for a first book in a series and for a debut novel. So a big thumbs up there for the Seventh Cadence. So overall that led to me giving this book 4 stars out of the traditional 5, so a good solid starting point there. On my weighted scale it did pretty decently as well. So of the overall enjoyment I gave it 16 out of 20 because I did really enjoy this book. I don't think there were any areas where I felt that I wasn't enjoying it and that it was a bit of a slog. We did have those slower points, but it didn't impact my enjoyment of the book overall. So 16 out of 20 there is a good solid start. The world building, I went slightly lower. I went to 15, partly because it's the first book in a series and we haven't had a chance to explore it all as yet. Partly because, as I say, the world map just looked a little bit kind of sparse. Possibly because we haven't done that exploration yet. Possibly there's other parts of this world that we will see in future books as well. For the characters, I've just said that I liked pretty much all of the characters that we came across in the story, so 16 out of 20 there. There was some really good work done. Couple of little downsides that I mentioned with regards to Telly and her reaction to certain events, but that's something that maybe would be worked on, I don't know. And then for the plot, that was back to 15 out of 20 again. There were some decent elements of the plot. There could have been more that was built in, but actually for a 700 and something page book, we did have the 3 distinct storylines that are all being kind of interwoven together at various points, and I did like how it all worked out overall, so not too bad in that respect either. The writing style I gave 6 out of 10. It was good, but it wasn't great, but it certainly wasn't at that kind of 50% or below mark, so there's some improvements that could be made here, as you would always expect, and probably more so with debut work. The pacing was one of those bits that I did have that slight issue with, as I've mentioned a couple of minutes ago, so that one was 3 out of 5 for me. It wasn't too bad and it wasn't in too much of a book, but just those certain areas I thought the pacing was just a little bit off for my particular tastes. And then to my discretionary section, where I've given this one a really good score of 4 out of 5. Within the book itself, as I say, there are various different maps, city maps, diagrams and so forth, so that does help to break up the book and also just to make it look that little bit nicer when you take in the book as a whole. The cover of it is absolutely gorgeous, as I've said, so that's definitely a plus point here. But also, as you've seen, I like to include a world map within my wrap-up videos, so I just asked the publisher if they had a copy of it and they sent me this nice colour copy to include in my video, so that's definitely a plus sign, and in my discretionary category that all adds up and it gives it a really good score there. So overall that adds up to 75%, which is a really good score, and if you look at some of the video reviews that I have done in the past, we'll see not only the scores that I gave those, but in my little Hall of Fame it tells you the titles that are around them. So this is towards the top end of my Hall of Fame itself, and there's some really good titles around and below the 7th Cadence. It does come in at equal 35th, which might not seem so high, but there are quite a lot of titles within that Hall of Fame, and pretty much to get in the 30s and to get above the 30s, it's got to be a really good read. And that's exactly what we had here. It was a good book. It was a really good solid opening to the series, and I'm really looking forward to more from this world, more from this author and these characters and so forth, but also more from this publisher as well if they're going to have similar titles in the future. So definitely something for you to look forward to. If you like your epic fantasy, if you like your titles like your Wheel of Time and so forth, I'm not going to say that the 7th Cadence is like the Wheel of Time or any of those other titles, but it does follow that similar pathway with the characters and the character journeys that we can see from those well-known titles. So definitely recommend this one anyway. If you're a fan of epic fantasy, I think it's one that you could enjoy. So that's it for me today anyway, so if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already done so. Drop me some comments below and let me know what your thoughts and expectations are for the 7th Cadence, if you've read it or if you're looking forward to reading it. I hope to catch you again soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books, and I'll see you later.